William accepted the night watch position, thinking it was safer than being a soldier. No battles, no charging horses, just peaceful nights walking castle walls. What he didn't realize was that he had just volunteered for the most dangerous job in medieval England, because night watchmen weren't hired to protect the castle. They were hired to die first, loudly enough to wake everyone else. Welcome to Whispers of History. Before we begin this incredible story of William, whose lonely footsteps once echoed through the cold stone corridors of medieval England's most dangerous castle, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe that true courage means facing the darkness when everyone else is sleeping, hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us honor those who stood watch in history's most perilous nights. The bell tower of Ravenscroft Castle chimed midnight as William Blackthorne pulled his woolen cloak tighter against the October wind. The sound echoed across the stone battlements like a death knell, and William couldn't shake the feeling that it might be his own. He had been the castle's night watchman for exactly 7 days, and already he was beginning to understand why the position had been vacant for so long. His predecessor, a grizzled old soldier named Edmund, had simply vanished one night 3 weeks ago. No body was ever found, no blood discovered, no signs of struggle. One evening Edmund had begun his rounds as usual, and by dawn he had simply ceased to exist. The castle's steward, a thin man with nervous eyes, had explained it away as desertion. Probably ran off to the nearest tavern, he had said with a forced laugh. These old soldiers, you know, can't handle the quiet life. But William wasn't so sure. He had served as a man-at-arms for Lord Robert for 2 years before accepting this position, and Edmund hadn't struck him as the type to abandon his post. The old watchman had been methodical, reliable, and most importantly, he had genuinely seemed to enjoy the solitude of night duty. When William had asked around the servants' quarters about Edmund's disappearance, the responses had been unsettling. Uncomfortable silences, quickly averted gazes, and hurried changes of subject. William had taken the job because it seemed like a step up from his previous duties. No more sleeping in the garrison with 20 other snoring soldiers. No more standing at attention in the great hall during endless political meetings. No more practicing sword work until his arms ached and his hands bled. Just peaceful nights walking the familiar walls of Ravenscroft, watching for threats that probably would never come. The castle sat on a rocky promontory overlooking the Yorkshire moors, its massive walls rising like black cliffs against the starlit sky. Built by Lord Robert's grandfather during the reign of King Henry II, Ravenscroft was considered one of the strongest fortifications in northern England. Its walls were 12 feet thick, its towers reached nearly 100 feet into the sky, and its great gatehouse was a masterpiece of defensive architecture. The castle had never fallen to siege, never been taken by assault, never even been seriously threatened by enemy forces, which made William wonder why they needed a night watchman at all. During his 7 nights on duty, William had developed a routine that seemed both logical and safe. He would begin his rounds at midnight, starting from the Great Keep and working his way clockwise around the outer walls. The circuit took approximately 2 hours to complete, which meant he could make 3 full rounds during his 8-hour shift. Between rounds, he would rest in the watchman's shelter, a small stone chamber built into the wall near the main gate. The shelter was Spartan but functional. It contained a simple wooden chair, a small table, a brazier for warmth, and a collection of items left by previous watchmen. A half-empty bottle of ale, a worn deck of playing cards, a few pieces of dried bread, and a leather-bound journal filled with observations about castle security. William had been reading through the journal during his rest periods, trying to understand the patterns of his new job. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about weather conditions, observations about the behavior of the castle's livestock, complaints about the quality of the torches provided by the steward. But as William read deeper into the journal, he began to notice references to things that made his skin crawl. Strange sounds coming from empty towers, shadows moving in ways that defied explanation, doors that were found open in the morning despite being securely locked the night before. And then there were the references to previous watchmen. The journal mentioned at least 6 different night watchmen over the past 3 years, each entry written in a different hand. Thomas, who had lasted 2 months before seeking better opportunities elsewhere. Marcus, who had served for 6 weeks before returning to his family in the South. Jeffrey, who had worked for 3 months before joining a merchant caravan bound for London. But the dates didn't add up. If these men had simply left for better positions, why had there been so many vacancies? Why did each new watchman seem to start his journal entries with comments about finding the shelter in disarray or strangely abandoned? And why did several of the later entries contain increasingly frantic observations about feeling watched from the shadows and hearing whispers in empty chambers? William was beginning to suspect that Ravenscroft Castle had a problem that went far beyond the need for basic security. On his 8th night, William decided to alter his routine. Instead of following his usual clockwise path around the walls, he would explore some of the castle's interior spaces that he had previously avoided. The Great Keep, in particular, had always felt somehow unwelcoming during his previous inspections. The massive stone structure rose 5 stories above the main courtyard, its narrow windows like empty eye sockets staring out into the darkness. The keep's ground floor housed the Great Hall, where Lord Robert held court during the day and entertained guests at elaborate feasts. During daylight hours, the hall was a bright and cheerful space, its walls decorated with colorful tapestries and its tables laden with silver plate and fine pottery. But at night, with only William's flickering torch for illumination, the great hall became something entirely different. The shadows seemed to move independently of the torch flame, creating an unsettling dance of light and darkness across the stone walls. The tapestries hung like funeral shrouds, their depicted scenes of hunting and warfare transformed into nightmarish tableaus by the uncertain light. And the silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft whisper of William's footsteps and the occasional crack of settling timbers. William climbed the narrow spiral staircase to the 2nd floor, where Lord Robert's private chambers were located. He had never been inside these rooms during his time as a man-at-arms, and his current duties didn't require him to patrol the interior of the keep. But something was drawing him upward, a sense that he needed to understand what was happening in this castle before he became another mysterious disappearance. The 2nd floor contained Lord Robert Solar, his private study, and a small chapel where the family attended morning prayers. All of the doors were closed and locked, which was normal for this time of night. William continued upward to the 3rd floor, which housed guest chambers for visiting nobles. These rooms were rarely occupied, especially during the autumn months when travel became difficult. But as William reached the 3rd floor landing, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. One of the chamber doors was standing slightly ajar. William approached the door carefully, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his sword. The door opened into what appeared to be a modestly furnished guest chamber, containing a bed, a wooden chest, a small table, and a single chair. But the room wasn't empty. Sitting in the chair, with his back to the door, was a figure in a dark cloak. The figure was completely motionless, so still that William initially thought it might be a trick of shadows and furniture. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the chamber's single window, he could make out the unmistakable shape of a human form. "Who goes there?" William called out, his voice echoing in stone chamber. "Identify yourself." The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even seem to be breathing. William stepped into the chamber, his torch held high, his sword half drawn from its scabbard. As he moved around to face the chair, he saw something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life, however long that might be. The figure in the chair was Edmund, the previous night watchman. Or at least, it had been Edmund. The body was mummified, desiccated, as if it had been sitting in that chair for months rather than weeks. The flesh had drawn tight against the bones, the eyes had sunken deep into their sockets, and the mouth hung open in what might have been a scream of terror or a gasp of final recognition. But the most horrifying aspect of the scene wasn't the condition of the body. It was the fact that Edmund was still wearing his night watchman's cloak, still carrying his torch and sword, still positioned as if he had simply sat down to rest during his rounds and had somehow been preserved in that moment forever. William backed out of the chamber, his mind reeling with implications. Edmund hadn't deserted. He hadn't run away to a tavern or joined a merchant caravan. He had died at his post, and someone or something had arranged his body as if it were a warning or a monument. But who would do such a thing? And why had no one noticed Edmund's absence from the living world? Surely someone would have missed him, would have come looking, would have discovered the body during routine cleaning of the guest chambers. Unless, William realized with growing horror, no one was supposed to find Edmund's body. Unless this was exactly where he was meant to be, exactly how he was meant to remain, as a message to whoever came after him. William fled the keep, his torch casting wild shadows as he ran through the corridors and down the spiral staircase. He burst out into the main courtyard, gasping the cold night air as if he had been drowning. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold his torch steady, and his heart was pounding with such force that he could hear it echoing off the castle walls. He needed to report this discovery immediately. He needed to wake Lord Robert, summon the steward, call for the castle's priest to perform last rites for Edmund's remains. This was clearly a matter for the authorities, not for a simple night watchman. But as William hurried toward the Lord's tower, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. There were lights moving in several of the castle's windows, not the steady glow of candles or oil lamps, but flickering, dancing lights that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. And more disturbing still, there were figures visible in some of the lighted windows, silhouettes that moved with purpose through chambers that should have been empty and locked. William counted at least a dozen separate lights, scattered throughout different towers and buildings within the castle complex. It was as if the entire fortress had suddenly come alive with activity in the middle of the night, populated by residents who didn't exist during daylight hours. And then William heard the voices. At first, they were just whispers carried on the wind, so faint that he might have mistaken them for the rustle of leaves or the distant sound of water. But as he stood still and listened, the whispers resolved into actual speech, conversations taking place in empty rooms, discussions held by people who shouldn't be there. The voices were speaking in languages William didn't recognize, but their tone was unmistakably urgent, as if they were debating matters of life and death. Occasionally he would catch a word or phrase in Norman French or Latin, but most of the conversation remained incomprehensible. William realized he was witnessing something that no living person was meant to see. The castle at night wasn't empty. It was occupied by residents from a different time, a different world, perhaps even a different plane of existence entirely. And Edmund hadn't been killed by human enemies or natural causes. He had been claimed by whatever forces ruled Ravenscroft Castle after darkness fell. William's training as a soldier told him to investigate further, to gather intelligence about this threat and report back to his superiors. But his instincts as a human being told him to run as far and as fast as his legs could carry him, to put as much distance as possible between himself and this haunted fortress. The conflict between duty and survival was resolved when William heard footsteps approaching from behind him. Slow, measured footsteps, the sound of boots on stone, walking with the steady rhythm of someone conducting a patrol. William turned around, expecting to see another guard or perhaps a servant on some late-night errand. Instead, he saw himself. Walking across the courtyard, torch in hand, was another William Blackthorne. Same face, same build, same night watchman's cloak and equipment. The duplicate William was following the exact route that the real William had taken during his first night on duty, moving with the same hesitant steps and frequent glances over his shoulder. As the real William watched in frozen terror, his duplicate completed the circuit of the outer walls and returned to the watchman's shelter. The duplicate sat down in the wooden chair, placed his torch in its bracket, and began reading from the leather-bound journal, exactly as William himself had done 7 nights ago. William understood now why the journal contained entries from so many different watchmen, why the dates didn't match up, why each new guard seemed to find the shelter strangely abandoned. The castle wasn't just haunted by the spirits of previous residents. It was haunted by the echoes of every night watchman who had ever served here. Every guard who had walked these walls, every man who had sat in that chair, every soul who had carried a torch through these corridors was still here, trapped in an endless cycle of repetition. They were all still performing their duties, night after night, unaware that they had died, unaware that they had become part of the castle's supernatural garrison. And now William was about to join them. He could feel it beginning already, a strange detachment from his own body, a sense that his movements were becoming automatic, that his thoughts were being guided by some external force. The terror was fading, replaced by a calm acceptance of his duties. After all, he was the night watchman of Ravenscroft Castle. He had rounds to complete, observations to record, a post to maintain. William found himself walking toward the watchman's shelter, his steps matching exactly the rhythm he had established during his first week on duty. The duplicate William looked up as he approached, nodded politely, and faded away like morning mist. There was room for only one night watchman at a time, and William's shift was just beginning. He sat down in the wooden chair and opened the leather journal to a fresh page. His hand moved without conscious direction, writing in neat script. 9th night of duty. Weather clear, wind from the northwest. All appears normal. The castle is quiet tonight, and I feel a strange sense of peace about my work here. This is exactly where I belong. As William wrote, he was dimly aware that somewhere else in the castle, another figure was beginning his own first night of duty. A new recruit, perhaps, nervous and uncertain, carrying a torch through corridors that seemed both familiar and threatening. The new man would walk the walls, examine the towers, eventually discover Edmund's body in the guest chamber. And in a week or so, when the new watchman had served his time and taken his place among the castle's permanent staff, another volunteer would arrive. The cycle would continue, as it had continued for decades, perhaps centuries, because Ravenscroft Castle needed its night watchmen, not to protect against external enemies, but to serve as anchors for the supernatural forces that had claimed the fortress as their own. The living guards provided a connection to the physical world, a way for the castle's ghostly inhabitants to maintain their presence in the realm of the living. William completed his journal entry and closed the book. It was time to begin his rounds. He had work to do, and eternity to do it in. As he stood and picked up his torch, William caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished metal of the torch bracket. His face looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but his eyes were different. They held the calm, patient expression of someone who had accepted his fate completely. He was no longer William Blackthorne, former man-at-arms and reluctant night watchman. He was simply the guard, the watcher, the eternal sentinel of Ravenscroft Castle, and he would walk these walls until the stones themselves crumbled into dust. Outside the shelter, William could hear the new watchman calling out in the darkness, his voice sharp with fear and confusion. The man had probably just discovered Edmund's body, or perhaps he had seen the moving lights in the windows, or heard the whispers in empty rooms. William smiled to himself. The new recruit would learn, just as he had learned. The castle was patient with its employees, gentle in its training methods. There was no rush, no pressure. Everyone came to understand their true duties eventually. The bell tower chimed 1 o'clock as William began his rounds. He had 7 more hours until dawn, 7 more hours to walk his appointed circuit, to observe and record and maintain his vigil. And tomorrow night, he would have 7 more hours, and the night after that, and the night after that, forever. The stone walls of Ravenscroft Castle rose around him like the walls of a tomb, but William no longer found them confining. They were home now, his home, his domain, his eternal responsibility. The cold wind that had once chilled him to the bone now felt like a gentle caress. The shadows that had once filled him with dread now welcomed him like old friends. As William walked the familiar battlements, he could sense the presence of his fellow watchmen. Edmund in his chair in the guest chamber, Marcus patrolling the south tower, Thomas examining the gatehouse defenses, Geoffrey walking the inner ward. They were all here, all still performing their duties, all still serving their lord and their castle in the only way they could. And somewhere in the darkness, a new voice was calling out in confusion and terror, demanding answers that would never come, seeking escape from a fate that had already been sealed. The newest night watchman was beginning his education, learning the first and most important lesson of his profession. Some duties don't end with death. Some posts are held forever. And some castles need guardians who will never abandon their watch, never desert their positions, never ask for relief or retirement. William paused at the eastern tower and looked out over the Yorkshire moors. In the distance, he could see the lights of the village where he had once lived, where his sister and her family probably still thought he was serving honorably as a castle guard. They would never know what had really happened to him, would never understand that he had found his true calling in the darkness of Ravenscroft's walls. The bell tower chimed 2 o'clock. William had completed his first circuit of the night, and it was time to begin his second. He turned away from the view of the outside world and continued his patrol, his footsteps echoing off the ancient stones in a rhythm that had been heard in these corridors for generations. Behind him, the sound of the new watchman's voice grew fainter, more distant, gradually fading into the whisper of wind through empty chambers. By dawn, there would be silence again. The castle would return to its daytime facade of normalcy, and the servants would begin preparing for the arrival of yet another volunteer for the night watch position. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. Ravenscroft Castle would keep its guardians, and its guardians would keep their eternal watch, walking the walls between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. And William Blackthorne, who had once been a man-at-arms seeking a safer position, would patrol those walls until the end of time, carrying his torch through the darkness and recording his observations in a journal that would never be read by living eyes. In the distance, the bell tower prepared to chime 3 o'clock. William quickened his pace slightly. He had rounds to complete, duties to fulfill, a watch to maintain. After all, he was the night watchman of Ravenscroft Castle, and the night was far from over. The morning sun would rise in a few hours, painting the castle walls with warm golden light and bringing the comfort of daylight to chase away the shadows. But William would not see that sunrise. He would not feel the warmth of the sun on his face or hear the cheerful sounds of the castle awakening to another day. He would be resting in the watchman's shelter, sitting in a wooden chair, waiting for darkness to fall again so he could resume his duties. And when night returned, as it always did, William would pick up his torch and begin his rounds once more. But William's story and his eternal watch was just beginning. Over the following weeks, months, and years, the pattern at Ravenscroft Castle continued with mechanical precision. Every few days, a new volunteer would arrive to take the position of night watchman. Some were former soldiers like William, drawn by the promise of steady pay and peaceful duty. Others were local men facing debts or family obligations, desperate for any employment that could keep their loved ones fed through the harsh Yorkshire winters. They all shared the same fate. Lord Robert, of course, knew nothing of what transpired during the dark hours in his castle. During the day, Ravenscroft appeared normal. Servants went about their duties. Guards manned the walls. Merchants came and went through the great gatehouse. The Lord held court in his solar, entertained guests in the great hall, and conducted the business of managing his lands and tenants. But at night, when the living retired to their chambers and the castle settled into what appeared to be peaceful slumber, another world awakened within those ancient walls. The supernatural residents of Ravenscroft had been there far longer than any of the current inhabitants realized. The castle had been built on a site that was sacred long before the first stone was laid, a place where ancient Celtic priests had once conducted rituals to honor the spirits of the dead. When Lord Robert's grandfather had chosen this rocky promontory for his fortress, he had unknowingly built his stronghold directly on top of what the local people called a thin place, a location where the barrier between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was paper thin. The construction of the castle itself had only made the situation worse. The massive stone walls had acted like a container, trapping spiritual energy within the confines of the fortress. Generation after generation of deaths within the castle, from natural causes, accidents, violence, and disease, had added to the supernatural charge building up within those walls. By William's time, Ravenscroft Castle had become a sort of spiritual battery, storing the accumulated energy of centuries of human emotion, suffering, and death. The living inhabitants during daylight hours provided a connection to the physical world, but it was the night watchman who served as the crucial link between the two realms. Each new watchman who joined the castle's eternal staff brought fresh energy to the supernatural ecosystem. Their life force, their memories, their individual personalities all became part of the complex spiritual matrix that governed the castle after dark. And as the ghostly population grew, so did their influence over the physical world. What had started as whispers and moving shadows gradually escalated into more dramatic manifestations. Servants began reporting that items moved on their own during the night. Kitchen staff would arrive in the morning to find elaborate meals prepared by invisible hands. Guards on day duty would discover that weapons and armor had been cleaned and polished while they slept. At first, these incidents were dismissed as the work of overly diligent servants or forgotten late-night activities. But as the phenomena became more frequent and more obvious, a sense of unease began to spread throughout the castle's living population. The breaking point came during the feast of All Hallows' Eve, exactly 3 years after William's disappearance. Lord Robert was hosting a grand celebration for the local nobility, a tradition that had been maintained by his family for generations. The great hall was filled with guests. The tables groaned under the weight of elaborate dishes, and the wine flowed freely as the assembled lords and ladies celebrated the harvest season. But as midnight approached, the traditional time when the veil between worlds was thinnest, the supernatural residents of Ravenscroft decided to make their presence known to the living. It began subtly, the torches flickering in unison, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed almost choreographed. The temperature in the great hall dropping noticeably, causing guests to pull their cloaks tighter despite the roaring fires in the hearths. The wine in the goblets rippling as if responding to some invisible vibration. Then the manifestations became more obvious. Servants who had died decades ago began appearing at the edges of the great hall, moving through their eternal duties of serving food and clearing tables. The ghostly figures were translucent but clearly visible, dressed in the livery of different eras spanning the castle's history. The assembled nobles watched in stunned silence as phantom servants placed spectral dishes on the tables, poured wine from empty bottles, and cleaned up spills that existed only in their otherworldly realm. The ghosts seemed completely unaware of the living guests, going about their work with the same dedication they had shown in life. But it was the appearance of the night watchman that truly terrified the assembled company. William was the first to manifest, walking calmly through the great hall with his torch held high, conducting his eternal rounds with the same methodical precision he had maintained for 3 years. He was followed by Edmund, still wearing his desiccated appearance, but moving with the steady gait of a dedicated guard. Behind them came Marcus, Thomas, Geoffrey, and a dozen other watchmen from different eras, all carrying torches, all following their assigned patrol routes through the crowded hall. The ghostly guards walked through tables, chairs, and people as if they were made of air, but their presence was so solid, so real, that several of the noble guests fainted from shock. Others fled the hall entirely, running into the night and never returning to Ravenscroft Castle. Lord Robert, to his credit, maintained his composure throughout the supernatural parade. As a descendant of Norman conquerors, he had been raised on stories of ghosts, spirits, and otherworldly encounters. But seeing the phantom garrison of his own castle conducting their eternal duties in his great hall was something for which no amount of family history could have prepared him. When the ghostly procession finally faded away, leaving only the scent of ancient torch smoke and the echo of spectral footsteps, Lord Robert rose from his chair and addressed his remaining guests. "My lords and ladies," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "it appears that Ravenscroft Castle has more residents than I previously realized. I believe it would be wise for us to accommodate our supernatural tenants rather than attempt to drive them away. This pragmatic approach to coexistence would define the castle's policies for generations to come." Following the All Hallows Eve revelation, Lord Robert made a series of decisions that fundamentally changed life at Ravenscroft Castle. Rather than attempting to exorcise the supernatural residents or abandon the fortress entirely, he chose to embrace the ghostly presence and find ways to coexist peacefully. The first change was the most obvious. No more night watchmen would be hired. The position was formally eliminated from the castle's roster, and existing guards were instructed to conduct their patrols only during daylight hours. The nighttime security of Ravenscroft would be left entirely in the capable hands of its phantom garrison. This decision proved to be remarkably effective. The supernatural watchmen were far more thorough and dedicated than any living guards could have been. They never slept, never took breaks, never abandoned their posts. They knew every stone of the castle, every hiding place, every secret passage. No enemy could approach Ravenscroft undetected, while William and his fellow spirits maintained their eternal vigil. Word of the castle's supernatural defenders soon spread throughout the region, adding to Ravenscroft's reputation as an impregnable fortress. Potential enemies began to whisper that the castle was protected not just by thick walls and skilled soldiers, but by an army of the dead who could not be killed, could not be bribed, and would never surrender. The psychological effect was profound. Several planned attacks on the castle were abandoned when word reached the plotters that Ravenscroft was haunted. Even the most hardened warriors were reluctant to assault a fortress defended by ghosts. But the supernatural presence at Ravenscroft extended far beyond military security. The phantom servants who had appeared during the All Hallows Eve feast proved to be equally dedicated to their eternal duties. Kitchen staff began arriving each morning to find that much of their work had been completed during the night. Floors were swept, dishes were cleaned, fires were banked, and food stores were organized with supernatural efficiency. The ghostly servants seemed to take particular pride in maintaining the castle's appearance. Tapestries were kept free of dust, metalwork was polished to a mirror shine, and even the most remote chambers were maintained in perfect condition. The castle began to acquire a reputation not just for its military strength, but for its impeccable upkeep and hospitality. Lord Robert established a set of protocols for interacting with the supernatural residents. Living servants were instructed to leave certain areas of the castle undisturbed during nighttime hours, allowing the ghostly staff to conduct their work without interference. A portion of each evening's meal was to be left in the Great Hall, not because the spirits needed food, but as a gesture of respect and recognition. Most importantly, the living inhabitants of Ravenscroft were taught to acknowledge the presence of their supernatural colleagues. A simple nod of recognition when encountering a ghost, a quiet good evening when passing a phantom guard, a word of thanks for work completed by invisible hands. These small courtesies helped maintain the delicate balance between the two populations of the castle. The arrangement worked better than anyone could have expected. The supernatural residents seemed to appreciate being recognized and respected rather than feared. In return, they took extra care to avoid frightening the living inhabitants and even began to assist with tasks that went beyond their original duties. William, in particular, became something of a supernatural steward for the castle. His methodical nature and attention to detail made him perfectly suited for overseeing the complex logistics of maintaining the large fortress. He began leaving detailed reports for Lord Robert, written in his ghostly hand on parchment that appeared each morning on the Lord's desk. These reports contained information that no living guard could have gathered. Detailed intelligence about the movements of potential enemies, observations about the loyalty and reliability of various servants, suggestions for improving the castle's defenses, and warnings about structural problems that required attention. Lord Robert came to rely on William's supernatural intelligence network more than he had ever depended on living advisors. The ghostly watchman had access to information that spanned decades, could observe activities without being detected, and had no personal agenda beyond the security and prosperity of Ravenscroft Castle. As years passed, the coexistence between living and dead at Ravenscroft Castle became a model for how supernatural encounters could be managed constructively. Other noble families, facing their own ghostly problems, began consulting with Lord Robert about techniques for negotiating with supernatural residents. The castle's reputation grew throughout England and beyond. Scholars came to study the phenomenon, priests arrived to investigate claims of benevolent hauntings, and nobles visited to witness the remarkable cooperation between the living and the dead. William became something of a celebrity among the supernatural community. Other ghosts from across the region began making pilgrimages to Ravenscroft, seeking his advice on how to coexist peacefully with the living. The castle developed into an unofficial embassy between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. But for William himself, the recognition and responsibility were secondary to his original purpose. He remained, first and foremost, the night watchman of Ravenscroft Castle. Every evening, as darkness fell across the Yorkshire moors, he would take up his torch and begin his eternal rounds. The routes had evolved over the years. Once he had simply patrolled the walls and towers, William now conducted a comprehensive security survey that included every chamber, every corridor, every hidden passage in the vast fortress. He checked locks, examined windows, tested the integrity of walls and gates, and maintained detailed observations about any changes or potential threats. His fellow Phantom Guards had developed their own specializations. Edmund focused on the castle's interior security. Marcus monitored the approaches from the moors. Thomas supervised the supernatural servants, and Geoffrey maintained watch over the Lord's family and honored guests. Together, they formed the most effective security force in medieval England, a team of dedicated professionals who could not be corrupted, could not be killed, and would never abandon their duties. The irony was not lost on William. In life, he had sought a position as night watchman because it seemed safer than being a soldier. He had wanted to avoid the dangers of battle, the uncertainty of campaign life, the constant threat of death that faced every man at arms. Instead, he had found himself in the most dangerous job imaginable, so dangerous that it had literally killed him. But in death, he had discovered something that had eluded him in life, a perfect match between his natural abilities and his assigned duties. William had been born to be a night watchman. His methodical nature, his attention to detail, his ability to remain calm under pressure, his dedication to duty above personal comfort, all of these qualities made him ideally suited for the role of supernatural guardian. And now he had eternity to perfect his craft. As the decades passed, William watched the world change around him. Lord Robert aged and died, passing the castle to his son, who in turn passed it to his own heir. New technologies were introduced, better weapons, improved fortifications, more sophisticated communication methods. Political alliances shifted, old enemies became friends, and new threats emerged from unexpected directions. But through all these changes, William and his phantom garrison remained constant. They adapted their methods to meet new challenges, learned to work with new generations of living inhabitants, and continued to provide the same level of security and service that had made Ravenscroft Castle famous throughout the realm. The living inhabitants of the castle began to view the supernatural residents not as frightening ghosts, but as honored ancestors who continued to serve their family and their home even after death. Children grew up knowing that William and his fellow guards were protecting them while they slept. Servants took comfort in knowing that experienced colleagues were helping them with their work, even if those colleagues were invisible. And William found a satisfaction in his eternal duties that he had never experienced in life. He was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do, serving a purpose that transcended individual mortality. The bell tower of Ravenscroft Castle continued to chime the hours, marking the passage of time in a place where time had different meanings for different residents. For the living, each chime brought them closer to their eventual deaths. For William and his fellow ghosts, each chime was simply another moment in an endless cycle of service and dedication. As the medieval period gave way to new eras, as castles became obsolete and new forms of warfare made stone fortifications irrelevant, Ravenscroft Castle remained occupied and well-maintained. The supernatural residents ensured that their home never fell into ruin, never became the empty shell that claimed so many other medieval fortresses. Visitors to the castle in later centuries would often comment on its remarkable preservation, its perfect condition, its sense of being somehow alive despite its great age. They attributed this to the excellent maintenance provided by successive generations of the Lord's family, never realizing that the real caretakers were invisible guardians who had been performing their duties for hundreds of years. And William walked on through the endless nights, carrying his torch through corridors that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth and death of generations, the slow transformation of the world from medieval to modern. His footsteps echoed off stones that had been laid by his mortal contemporaries, past windows that had watched the passage of centuries, through chambers that had housed dozens of generations of living families. He was no longer William Blackthorne, former man-at-arms and reluctant night watchman. He was something more enduring, more essential. He was the guardian, the eternal watcher, the spirit who ensured that some places, some duties, some loyalties would never be abandoned or forgotten. The darkness of Ravenscroft Castle was no longer threatening to William. It was home, sanctuary, the realm where he belonged and where he would always belong. And in that darkness, surrounded by the companionship of his fellow phantom guards and the gratitude of the living inhabitants they protected, William had found a peace that surpassed anything he had known in mortal life. The night watch continued, as it always had, as it always would, and in that eternal vigilance, there was comfort not just for those who slept safely within the castle walls, but for all who knew that some duties transcend death, some loyalties survive the grave, and some guardians never abandon their posts. The stones of Ravenscroft Castle remember every footstep, every whispered prayer, every moment of courage shown by those who stood watch in the darkness. Sleep peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the shadows of history, William and his fellow guardians continue their eternal rounds, maintaining their vigil, protecting the innocent from dangers they will never see. Close your eyes and rest, secure in the knowledge that true dedication knows no boundaries, not even the boundary between life and death. The night watchman's duty is never done, the guardian's vigil never ends, and the castle's defenders never rest. And in that endless service, that tireless devotion, that supernatural dedication to duty, there is a profound comfort for all who seek safety in an uncertain world. Let the echo of ghostly footsteps on ancient stones lull you into peaceful dreams, knowing that the watch continues, the guardians remain, and the darkness holds no terror for those who are protected by love that transcends death itself.